Before we go into it, I wanted to mention a book I'm currently reading, a fantastic book called The Pythons Autobiography by the Pythons. That's obviously referring to the Monty Python comedy group. It's a bit of a monster, this book. It's about 450 pages. I'm about two-thirds of the way through it at this point. But it's very, very compelling. We reviewed Monty Python The Holy Grail, their fabulous film, recently on Film Gold. And of course, the Rutles were the bridge between Monty Python and the Beatles, obviously having Eric Idle as one of the main people. And George Harrison had a cameo in the film as well, of course. But I wanted to comment on the many other similarities between the Pythons and the Beatles. I knew some of these already, but reading this book, it's really quite amazing. So I'll go through a few of these. You have to sort of think of the Pythons as the rock stars of the comedy world, certainly in that late 60s to about the, late 70s period, really, with The Life of Brian in 1979. So let's just go through a few of these. So complex intergroup dynamics. Of course, that's common to many other groups, but if you take the Rolling Stones, for example, it seems that in the original incarnation, it was really Mick, Keith and Brian that had the complex relationships, and then, Wyman and Watts were at the back, and you never really heard much of any tension between them and the other members of the group. Whereas with the Pythons and with the Beatles, you had these 4 in the Beatles and 6 in the Pythons, very distinct and all pretty strong personalities working together. It's kind of a miracle, really. I always think that these kind of groups get anything done, really. And you can imagine, and I know from reading this book, the tensions that went into it and all the stress. But of course, they're very happy with the end product. I thought it might be fun to do a sort of person-by-person comparison of the two groups. Let me preface by saying this doesn't really work, but it's just a fun indulgence for me, really. So I'd say John Cleese is the kind of John Lennon figure, the figure they generally looked up to, certainly at the start, literally with John Cleese because he's so tall, but also the person who seemed quite detached from the group and had quite a lot of edge to their personality, arguably more than the others in the group. Now, the Michael Palin, Terry Jones duo, let's call it, because they generally wrote together. If you don't know with the Pythons, by the way, generally John Cleese and Graham Chapman wrote together, Palin and Jones wrote together, Idle wrote on his own, and Terry Gilliam did the animation. So Palin and Jones I'd liken to Paul McCartney, perhaps they're the most likeable, generally the most industrious, because what I discovered in this book, in the latest seasons of the TV series, they tended to do more writing than the others. Eric Idle had sort of a lie with George Harrison. They were pretty good friends actually in the 70s, and Idle wrote alone, as did Harrison in the Beatles, while surrounded by a writing team or 2 writing teams in the Pythons' case. And Terry Gilliam really is nothing like Ringo Starr, but just for the sake of filling this out, Gilliam's animations sort of bridged these quite disjointed sketches and made it some kind of whole. And I'd liken that to Ringo's fills and his overall drum work, kind of doing a similar thing. I mean, if you think of John Lennon's quite strange time signatures, they've all remarked about that. His songs had these weird signatures, such as All You Need Is Love, Good Morning, and other ones. If you think of that as an equivalent of anarchic and nonsensical Python sketches, then maybe Gilliam and Ringo were doing something of a similar job, kind of a glue to put it all together, let's say. And that leaves us with Graham Chapman, who the Pythons all say in this book was just simply a one-off, impossible to really know, and off with the fairies a lot of the time, especially in the years when he was an alcoholic. So anyway, yeah, that's my tenuous comparison. Hope you enjoyed that. But there are other similarities. So here's a few. The Pythons made albums, as in record albums, that were a little like the Beatles' Christmas fan club records, even down to the names, because there's, I think it's called the Monty Python album, then another Monty Python album, and the second Beatles Christmas record was called Another Beatles Christmas Record. The Pythons also made a song album called Monty Python Sings. They did live concerts, gigs, if you will, and the audience would shout out the lines just as they do with singing the lyrics when bands like the Beatles and other bands are doing concerts. I suppose in the Beatles days they didn't do that. They just literally just screamed the house down. Both groups played the Hollywood Bowl, and in fact on the film Monty Python at the Hollywood Bowl, which came out in the early 80s, you can actually see George Harrison with Olivia during the intermission. George was in one of his mustachioed periods. It's during the intermission where John Cleese is going along the aisles selling albatross, mocking the habit in the old days in cinemas of the ice cream lady going up and down the aisles selling ice cream during the interval. The Pythons also started their own company, as did the Beatles, and in this Python book they talk about the need to not get screwed and let the company descend into chaos. I can't imagine what that's referring to. They also talk about the problem of division of writing royalties, which again is something you associate with pop rock songwriters. The Beatles and the Pythons both made films, and I'd argue Magical Mystery Tour isn't a million miles away from the Python style. They both rejected an outside director and then did it themselves. In the Pythons' case, it was Terry Jones and Terry Gilliam co-directing The Holy Grail, and then Terry Jones doing Life of Brian on his own. The Pythons actually technically made 5 films, but I would discount And Now for Something Completely Different, because that was a compilation of sketches. Live at the Hollywood Bowl was like a live album, if you will. And then Meaning of Life was kind of just sketches put together as well. So if you don't know Monty Python very well, I would point you directly to Monty Python The Holy Grail and Monty Python's Life of Brian as 2 fantastic films. The Holy Grail film was partly funded by rock bands, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd and Genesis. They actually contributed between them about half of the financing. You know, these things get reported wrongly, and it was reported that, Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd paid for the whole film, which wasn't true. However, I believe George Harrison did pay for all of Life of Brian, and quite a funny reference to leave you with. Elvis Presley was apparently a Python fan and would call people squire after the famous Nudge Nudge Wink Wink sketch, one of Python's most famous sketches from the TV series. And he would also quote Holy Grail lines in his latter years as well. Elvis, of course, tragically didn't live to see the Life of Brian. There are actually other similarities, but I think that's enough for now.